Since the European Union insists on going its own way and ignoring warnings, they shouldn't blame China for not being polite. On July 6, China's Ministry of Finance announced that, effective immediately, procurement budgets for medical devices exceeding 45,000 RMB must exclude the participation of EU enterprises. Furthermore, for non-EU enterprises involved in supplying, the proportion of medical devices imported from the EU cannot exceed half of the total contract value. The Chinese Ministry of Commerce simultaneously stated in a press conference that on June 20, the EU decided to restrict Chinese companies from participating in its public procurement of medical devices, listing 25 Chinese medical device companies for key scrutiny. This involves high-value consumables such as cardiac stents and surgical robots. Data shows that in 2024, China's medical device exports to the EU reached 4.86 billion euros, accounting for 12.3% of the EU market share. This artificially imposed market access barrier is essentially using administrative means to distort competition, which runs counter to the spirit of the WTO Government Procurement Agreement. As the EU Chamber of Commerce in China stated, this move will drive up procurement costs for European medical institutions, ultimately harming the interests of European patients. China has repeatedly expressed its willingness to resolve differences with the EU through dialogue and consultation. However, the EU has stubbornly adopted restrictive measures. Therefore, China has no choice but to take reciprocal countermeasures. The spokesperson emphasized that "no choice but" means simply that the EU made the first move, and then China decided to retaliate symmetrically. Trade tensions escalate ahead of summit. Just 2 days before the Ministry of Finance's official announcement, China's Ministry of Commerce announced an average tariff of 32.2% on imported European distilled grape wines, mainly brandy. This move also falls within the scope of China's having to counterattack, targeting the EU's announcement in October last year of additional anti-subsidy tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, which could be as high as 35.3%. Additionally, the EU had previously cancelled a high-level China-EU economic dialogue. Recently, China also shortened the 2-day schedule of the upcoming China-EU summit, originally set for July 24-25, to 1 day. With less than 3 weeks until the summit, bilateral relations remain strained. There are 3 main reasons behind the persistent tension. 1. The lingering EV anti-subsidy tariff issue. Since the EU initiated its anti-subsidy investigation into Chinese electric vehicles at the end of 2023, China has consistently hoped to resolve the issue through dialogue and even proposed a minimum export price scheme. This minimum export price solution was adopted in 2013 to resolve the China-EU photovoltaic export dispute. However, 11 years later, the EU is now unwilling to accept it. Last October, the anti-subsidy tariffs were formally implemented after an EU vote. Almost simultaneously, as a countermeasure, China announced an anti-dumping investigation into brandy exported from the EU. This investigation primarily targets France, as France has been a main proponent of the additional tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. Entering 2025, with Donald Trump wielding tariff sticks globally, China and the EU also began negotiations in April on minimum price commitments for electric vehicles. However, as of now, there has been no decisive progress. Reports suggest that China's proposed minimum price of 30,000 euros per vehicle did not meet the EU's expectations and was rejected. Furthermore, disputes exist over price regulation, implementation details, and joint supervisory mechanisms. The EU has also proposed demands for technical cooperation, such as battery recycling and green technology sharing. China remains open to this, but emphasizes the need to comply with international trade rules and avoid unilateral restrictive clauses. Last week, in preparation for the upcoming China-EU summit, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi visited Europe. French media revealed that during his meeting with Foreign Minister Callas, the EU's top diplomat, Callas put forward 3 demands. China is not an adversary of the EU, but on the security front, China's behavior in assisting Russia puts immense pressure on China-EU relations. Callas demanded that China must address this contradiction. What does this mean? Callas is implicitly suggesting that if China wants to advance China-EU relations, it must stop aiding Russia and choose between Russia and Europe, not wanting both. Callas's premise for the statement is completely wrong. Regarding the claim of aiding Russia, China has repeatedly stressed that we strictly control dual-use items and have never provided weapons to either side of the conflict. As a neutral party, we have the right to conduct normal economic and trade activities with Russia. The notion that Chinese enterprises are supporting Russia's actions is pure slander and illogical. Frankly, if China were truly aiding Russia, the situation would not be as it is today. 2. EU demands end to rare earth export restrictions. The EU demands that China end all export restrictions on rare earths, stating that China's actions pose severe risks to European companies. It's worth noting that on the rare earth issue, the EU's attitude and actions have always been opportunistic. On one hand, they express fear and hope that China will resolve the rare earth issue as soon as possible to ensure their industrial development. On the other hand, they constantly engage in petty actions. Just a few days ago, EU Commissioner for Internal Market Thierry Breton even said they would hit China back and seek alternative resources, establish joint rare earth reserves, and thus reduce dependence on China. EU Ambassador to China Jorge Toledo stated in Beijing that the EU hopes China can resolve the current rare earth shortage before the China-EU leaders meeting next month. Take a moment to ponder the meaning of these words. Isn't there a hint of threat? It's as if they're saying, if you don't resolve the rare earth supply within 30 days, our leaders won't come. Toledo claimed that the shortage of magnets has had a very, very severe impact on European companies. Europe is asking China to understand the fears and concerns of European companies. He declared that Europe simply wants a level playing field, and cited data saying that while China's economy has grown by 40% since 2017, EU exports to China have fallen by 30%. However, in reality, interpreting China's new rare earth regulations purely from the perspective of international competition would be to belittle China's policy strategy. China's export controls on rare earth-related items are implemented in accordance with the law and, more importantly, are a concrete fulfillment of international non-proliferation obligations. It is an inevitable step for China, as an important global supplier of key minerals, to align with international best practices, enhance its governance capabilities, and fulfill its responsibilities as a major country. Regarding rare earths, a spokesperson for the Chinese Foreign Ministry has previously clarified that China's export control measures comply with international practices, are non-discriminatory, and are not aimed at specific countries. On the 26th, Ministry of Commerce spokesperson He Yadong also reiterated that China has approved a certain number of compliant applications in accordance with the law and will continue to strengthen the review of compliance. Analyst Noah Barkin of Rhodium Group believes that China will not change its economic model just because it is holding a summit with the EU. In fact, the EU's current dissatisfaction, to put it plainly, is due to their misunderstanding of their own position in the context of China's competition. They hope to see a scenario where China restores the open circulation of rare earths and grants exemptions to non-military European enterprises. Of course, more importantly, they still want special treatment from China. After all, the United States is not yet on the export license list. This highlights a divergence in China-EU management mechanisms for exercising resource sovereignty. On the other hand, it is also because for a long time, Europe's defense system has relied on American technology, and 30% of its raw materials come from Chinese rare earths. This means that the EU is caught in a dilemma between economic demands and defense TIs. They want to benefit from cooperation with China, but they cannot escape their defense dependence on the United States. This model of economy relying on China, security relying on the US, is deeply embedded in the EU's development system, but ultimately comes down to the EU's weak strategic autonomy. They want technological alternatives, but are constrained by costs. Coupled with constant pressure from the US to pick sides, the EU has become a sandwich layer. 3. EU demands feasible plans to reshape China-EU trade relations. The EU demands that China come up with feasible solutions to reshape China-EU trade relations. The overall trajectory of China-EU relations over the past 6 months has not developed rapidly in a positive direction, as it did during the Trump 1.0 era. Despite increasing US-EU contradictions, the EU is increasingly emphasizing the competitive nature of China-EU relations. This is counterintuitive, but true. Under pressure from Trump, the EU has not clearly moved closer to China. They seem to prefer to indirectly prompt China to make policy adjustments more favorable to Europe by pushing for competition between China and the US. Of course, China-EU relations are still far from reaching a freezing point. They are merely continuously strained. The significant conflicts of interest among the 27 EU member states, coupled with the undeniable fact of Trump's presidency, all indicate that China still has considerable room for diplomatic maneuver in Europe. This is why we see that China's current trade restrictive measures against the EU are not very strong and leave some room for flexibility. For example, on the brandy issue, relevant companies that negotiate with China and reach a minimum price commitment can avoid high tariffs. 34 EU companies have benefited from this, and French President Emmanuel Macron has also welcomed it. It can be said that as long as the EU is willing to resolve issues through dialogue and shed some inappropriate notions about China, everything will be easy to handle. As Foreign Minister Wang Yi recently said during his visit to Europe, there are no fundamental conflicts of interest between China and the EU. An Australian special plane will arrive in Beijing next week. The Australian Prime Minister this time seems to be coming with ill intentions, intending to personally persuade China to voluntarily give up the 99-year lease of Darwin Port. According to the South China Morning Post, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese plans to arrive in Beijing around July 15th and attend the 3rd China International Supply Chain Expo, which opens on July 16th. Sources familiar with the matter revealed that in addition to conventional topics such as economy and trade, he may discuss the Darwin Port deal with China and personally explain Australia's position on Chinese enterprise investment. To put it bluntly, Albanese wants to persuade us to give up the 99-year lease of Darwin Port because they want to break the contract but are unwilling to bear the consequences of breach and don't want to anger China. Therefore, they hope to minimize the harm through this visit to China. Earlier this year, Australia began hyping the issue, bringing up the contract breach again. Afterwards, in May, the re-elected Albanese also expressed approval, euphemistically stating that they want Darwin Port back in Australian hands. He even said that if Darwin Port cannot find a new buyer, he is willing to nationalize it. The meaning is very clear. No matter what, Australia wants to reclaim Darwin Port, which is currently operated by a Chinese enterprise. However, according to the lease, we are not supposed to end it until at least 2114. As of now, this lease has only been in effect for a mere 10 years. There's still a long way to go. Australia's urgency is simply due to the fact that Darwin Port has been improving and becoming more profitable under Chinese enterprise management, and they want to exclude Chinese enterprises and monopolize the benefits themselves. Although Darwin Port is an important port hub in northern Australia, it is not the largest port itself. Its development cannot be sustained purely by internal means and requires external forces for promotion and development. After taking over Darwin Port, China's Landbridge Group invested over $1 billion Australian dollars in upgrading its equipment and facilities. It can be said that Darwin Port was built from scratch. To have a large deep water area at the port, Landbridge Group built a 2,000,000-ton deep water berth, a fully automatic loading and unloading system, and the largest cold chain logistics center in the Southern Hemisphere. Among the construction and upgrade of Darwin Port have greatly boosted the development of surrounding linked industries and created ample job opportunities for the Darwin Port area. It can be said that China gave Darwin Port a second life. Now, the Australian government is performing an act of unloading the mill and killing the donkey, attempting to make Landbridge Group's 10 years of hard work go to waste. This is something we cannot tolerate. Therefore, a spokesperson for China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs gave a strong response to the Darwin port issue. On May 27, during a regular press conference hosted by the Foreign Ministry spokesperson, a Bloomberg reporter asked Ms. Mao Ning about the operation and acquisition of Darwin Port. Ms. Mao Ning responded that the relevant Chinese enterprise obtained the lease of Darwin Port through market-based means, and its legitimate rights and interests should be fully protected. According to a May 27 report by People's Daily, an American private equity firm intends to bid for the strategically significant Darwin Port. Why would the US say Darwin Port is strategically significant? And why go to such great lengths to acquire it? In fact, Darwin Port's decline is partly related to the United States. After the US Marine Corps was stationed in Darwin Port, the costs of expanding and maintaining base facilities led to severe financial deficits for the Northern Territory government, which then had no choice but to sell Darwin Port. Darwin Port is located in the northwest of Australia in Oceania, at the confluence of the Arafura Sea and the Timor Sea. It is also the core port of Australia's Northern Territory government, only 1,400 kilometers from the equator. It is also Australia's closest major city to Southeast Asia, and the only convergence point of the Indian and Pacific Oceans, controlling the transportation choke point between Southeast Asia and Australia. Over 12,000 merchant ships pass through annually, giving it significant economic value. In addition to its commercial value, Darwin Port also has certain military strategic value. Darwin Port's radar monitoring station can monitor the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait in real time, providing comprehensive surveillance of the Chinese Navy's movements in the South China Sea, even comparable to Guam. Most importantly, it is a core supply point for the Seventh Fleet. The United States has built a permanent military base within 15 nautical miles of the port and stationed over 2,500 US Marine Corps personnel. More than 2 million tons of strategic materials are transported annually. In recent US-Australia joint exercises, Darwin Port accounted for 75% of troop transport. From this, it can be seen that Darwin Port has important strategic support for US military deployments in the Pacific. However, the operating rights of Darwin Port are currently still in China's hands. Since China's acquisition was legitimate, the United States cannot exert military pressure and can only attempt to acquire it through economic means. In recent years, the United States has not only provoked militarily, but also constantly targeted China economically. We all know that Darwin Port is not the only place where the US has appeared. Early this year, the highly publicized Li Ka-shing port sale also had the US behind it. In March and April of this year, Li Ka-shing attempted to sell 43 packaged ports to the American financial group BlackRock, but this was met with strong opposition from China, and the deal is currently at a standstill. Why is the US vigorously acquiring important ports? There are many reasons, but the most important one is that the US wants to block China's sea lanes. With the development of China's economy and the Belt and Road Initiative, many countries along the route have extensive trade ties with China, highlighting the importance of ports to China. The US believes that the most likely way to cause severe economic damage to China is to block its sea lanes. This led to the incident of China acquiring Li Ka-shing's ports, and now the attempted acquisition of Darwin Port. All are despicable means to suppress China's legitimate rights. However, the acquisition of ports to suppress China's development also has other underlying reasons. In current international trade, the important role of ports is fully evident. The US wants to acquire ports to recover its domestic fiscal deficit and collect tolls from other countries. However, there are numerous international ports, and the US does not have such immense financial strength to acquire them all at once. Just like when Trump first took office and demanded Norway sell Greenland, the US's intentions are well known globally. If Greenland were to become US territory, the US would control the Arctic shipping route. The acquisition of the Panama Canal is similar. However, Unlike the Panama Canal, Darwin Port has significant military strategic value, which is why the US wants to acquire it quickly. But will China allow it to succeed? China's response to the Australian government's attitude is very clear. The operating rights of Darwin Port were obtained through legal and reasonable procedures. If Australia unilaterally terminates the contract, that is absolutely impossible. China has invested a large amount of capital and immense effort in Darwin Port, and will not allow others to benefit from it for free. China and Australia are comprehensive strategic partners. The Australian government should understand how to cooperate with its strategic partners, and should not engage in such perfidious actions against a partner. Once Australia makes a move to reclaim Darwin Port, its international influence will be greatly diminished. Many countries will be hesitant to cooperate with Australia. From the current reaction of the Albanese government, it is clear that they are caught in the middle, hesitant, and in a dilemma. In fact, the Albanese government also understands that China acquired the port legitimately, and they cannot use strong arm tactics to seize the operating rights of Darwin Port. Furthermore, China's military strength is not something Australia can contend with. Although Australia has the backing of the US 7th Fleet, recent Chinese naval exercises show that the US does not have a significant advantage in military confrontation with China. Moreover, the US has a good habit of abandoning its allies. If Australia were to get into a conflict with China, the US would not confront China just for a port, especially when they might not even win. Surely, the Albanese government has not forgotten the sight of China's Type 055 destroyers circling Australia, making Australia feel the might and pressure of Chinese warships. Therefore, for the current Australian government, the Darwin Port issue is not about whether to reclaim it, but rather how Australia will position itself internationally and respond to China's reaction after reclaiming it. After all, China is the world's largest market, and nearly 2/3 of Australia's trade is with China. If cooperation ceases, Australia's economy will collapse. Regarding the Darwin Port incident, China's reasoning is well-founded. China is upholding its legitimate rights and interests, which can be asserted at any time. The past US conspiracies will not succeed. Looking at it now, it truly is a case where dignity exists only at the edge of the sword, and truth lies only within the range of a cannon.